Yes, Sony did exceed my personal expectations. Let's jump right in and talk about all the good things like no recording limits and also bad things such as overheating. You've read the specs, so I will focus on the most important real-world things such as battery life, image quality, rolling shutter, IBIS, and much more. If you're gonna pre-order one, please use my link down below, and if you wanna see the A7S III compared to the Canon R5, hit that subscribe button and enable those notifications. As you'd expect, we finally have a flippy screen, but what I didn't expect is that the buttons and the dials are much nicer to use, and the record button has been moved up here. I also didn't expect dual UHS 2 card slots that double as CF Express Type A slots, which you only need for one special setting, but more on that in just a bit. I was pleasantly surprised by the updated port covers and underneath them, a full-size HDMI that can output full 16-bit RAW, 60 frames per second at just higher than 4K. The $11,000 Sony FX9 needs a $2,500 unit to do this, but the A7 III costs $3,500. This also shoots 4K 120 frames per second without pixel binning with full autofocus and audio. The FX9 does 4K 60 with a crop, and on top of that we have 1080 at 240 frames per second. These are the things that I really wanted, but I thought I was just too optimistic, and I'm glad that I was wrong. We have a new OLED EVF that definitely helps with focusing. It is higher res and bigger than the A9 II and the A7R IV, and so big that they even put in a smaller software option. The rear screen is also higher res, but what's more important is the sampling. Previously, I'd sometimes shoot in photo mode when I'm manually focusing, but it is much better now. The touchscreen is more responsive now, and we have full touch support even for the function bar, so you can change things like audio without shaking the camera, but unfortunately you still have to hit that function button, so it'd be nice to have an on-screen function button just like Panasonic gives us. With that, the menus are way better, and it only took a few hours to get used to them instead of months. Photo settings are now separate from video, and manual photo mode is now right next to the video and S&Q button. Here's the first downside. The sensor is 12 megapixels, which is on the low end for photos, but that is also what makes the A7S III so capable for video. The sensor itself is brand new, and as I expected, it is backside illuminated, and it reads out about 3 times faster than the A7S IIs, and the new processors, yes there are 2 of them, are 8 times faster, which allows for full quality 4K 120 without pixel binning and good 1080p without line skipping. I tested the new high-speed Wi-Fi, and transferring a 1-minute 4K clip took 2 minutes instead of 10 minutes with my A7 III. It's still slow, but now it's actually usable if you need it. The USB-C port is much faster now and allows for PD charging at around 30 watts. I fully charged the battery in 1 hour and 15 minutes instead of about 2.5 hours using Sony's $100 charger. Now Sony said that it won't charge the battery while the camera is on and the charging light does shut off, but I tested it with a dead battery and it recorded for over an hour until the card was filled. So it will still pull enough power to run the camera indefinitely from a power bank. I'll leave my suggested one down below. As for the battery life, I was pleasantly surprised with 4K up to 60 frames per second. At 4K 24, I got 2 hours and 40 minutes of continuous recording, and 4K 60 was an hour and 50 minutes, which is more than I expected. Now 4K at 120 lasted for 1 hour and 5 minutes, which is low, but I guess it's expected if you're shooting that many frames per second with full IBIS and autofocus and having the screen brightness maxed out. With that said, if you're shooting 4K 24 with a new efficient codec and a power bank, you can get over 9 hours of continuous recording on a cheap 256GB card while getting better quality than before, but more on codecs in just a bit. First, overheating. I tested in a 73-degree room and the camera doesn't heat up at 4K 24 or 30. Now Sony mentioned that it could do 4K 60 up to an hour, but it seems that they are understating it. I made the test the toughest way that I could for a controlled environment. That's with autofocus tracking, IBIS, highest quality display modes and frame rates, sunny brightness, and I kept the screen closed, which actually traps heat in between here. Sony does still have the high heat mode, which allows the camera to keep going if the heat logo shows up, which I did enable, and I recorded 4K 60 continuously for 1 hour and 53 minutes, which is when the battery died and the heat logo didn't even show up. I talked to another person who went through 3 batteries like that, so over 5 hours of recording, and it didn't overheat. That is thanks to an internal passive cooling design that dissipates heat 5 times better than the A7S II while having better dust and moisture sealing. I did mention that it overheated, and that was in 4K 120, which can record continuously. After 20 minutes, the heat logo showed up, but it kept chugging along until the 45-minute mark where it shut down. I waited just about a minute before hitting record again, and then it went for another 15 minutes. Now in the real world, over the course of a day, I shot a ton of shorter 4K 120 clips in 90-degree weather outside, and the heat logo didn't even come up once. Now one downside is that the new active stabilization mode isn't available when you're shooting 4K 120. When you enable active stabilization, that uses a gyro to get a 1.1 crop, which is still a 1:1 UHD readout off of the sensor, and the stabilization is much better. This tells me that the full frame is slightly oversampled since it's not using digital stabilization that can cause artifacts, but instead it just allows the IBIS to move around a lot more. When you pair this with a stabilized lens, it results in a huge improvement over the old Sony cameras, but without this mode, like in 4K 120, the IBIS isn't that much better than before, probably because it's limited in its movement. The autofocus has been performing great. It's the same as the A7R IV, but with increased low light performance thanks to the sensor and more adjustability for sensitivity and transition speed. Now let's talk about rolling shutter. When I heard of this sensor and I heard that it could do 4K 120, I knew that it would not disappoint, and I was right. It is not perfect, but it is basically negligible. Now let's talk about the quality of the image. Since it's a 12 megapixel sensor, there is no line skipping or pixel binning in 4K, and its 1080p is oversampled from 4K, which is why it looks better than a lot of cameras, including the A7 III, with less artifacts and noise. As far as 4K quality, the A7 III is sharper due to its 24 megapixel 6K to 4K oversampling, but not by as much as I expected, probably because it has an anti-aliasing filter where the A7S III doesn't. I was also very curious if there is any quality loss when shooting 60 or 120 FPS like we get with most cameras, and thankfully I couldn't find any. The detail looks identical between 4K 24 and 60 and 120, and I'm not seeing any more aliasing or any other issues, so what Sony said about achieving an uncompromised 4K image is true. The only difference that I could see was a bit of noise, but that's because my ISO was set 5 times higher in 4K 120. Now the A7S II was the best low light camera, and now the A7S III one-ups it by about a stop, and compared to the A7 III, it's definitely better, but the A7 III has a smaller grain structure due to that oversampling. It also maintains color and contrast way better at higher ISOs than previous Sonys. I did some low-light codec comparisons the next day and found that HEVC 10-bit 420 was the best and HEVC 10-bit 422 was the worst, which is what I used in the previous comparison you just saw with the A7S II. Along with that, the 420 also has less noise and more detail than the all-eye codec that can go up to 600 megabit per second or even 1200. So let's talk about codecs. Sony went all out. Not only do we finally have a 10-bit codec, which is great for S-Log, but Sony did it right. The old IPB H.264 codecs are still there, but now they added H.265 and all-eye H.264 as well. Unlike the Canon R5, which forces you into 8-bit 420 or 10-bit HEVC 422, Sony will let you choose your codec, your bitrate, and your chroma subsampling. For HEVC 10-bit, you could choose between 422 like the R5, which is really difficult to edit, or 420 10-bit, which is much easier like Fuji and Panasonic have. My only complaint is that for some reason the HEVC codec is missing 4K 30, which makes no sense because it's available in the other options. All-eye is locked at higher bit rates, but HEVC has multiple options from 100 megabit per second, which will be the same file size as the older Sonys, but twice the quality, or down to 30 megabits per second to save space while keeping the same quality as the old 60. Overall, there are a lot of reasonable options, and because of this, most people will only need SD cards. In fact, the only modes that need fast V90 SD cards is the all-eye and 4K 120. And the only modes that require the new CF Express Type A cards is the S&Q mode in all-eye that can record up to 1,200 megabits per second. Now that is because it will boost up the data rate to maintain the best quality possible for the best slow motion, but you can still take advantage of some of that by going with HEVC in that mode. My only complaint about cards is that the Sonys are very picky with the cards. Their older Sony G cards are more than twice as fast as the V90 standard, but they weren't labeled V90, and because of that, the camera will not allow me to use them at the higher options. I'll go ahead and link my suggested SD cards down below. As far as dynamic range, Sony rates it at 15 plus stops in S-Log3, and the A7 III was rated for 14 plus, so this sensor should definitely be better, but my comparison test got messed up, so I'm gonna have to do that in a follow-up video. Either way, it's definitely good, and now that we have 10-bit codecs, S-Log3 will actually be usable. What really helps here is that the base ISO is now 80, and for S-Log, it is 160 instead of 800 on the A7 III and 1600 on the A7S II, which is so helpful outdoors. A few more notable things are the 4-channel recording with their XLR adapter that I don't have, and the new creative look options if your picture profile is turned off. Colors have definitely been updated, but unfortunately I couldn't find anything about the Cinetone option that clearly stated in the camera. White balance can now be adjusted while you're recording, which is great for long format shooting, and you can set it to smoothly adjust, which is helpful for auto modes. Overall, the A7S III isn't perfect, but it definitely exceeded my expectations. All of my complaints were met, and I can't wait to shoot with it more and make some other comparisons and videos for you guys, so make sure you guys are subscribed. Go ahead and ask your questions down below and check out the links in the video description as well. This has been Max, and I will see you in the next video.